Let's go live now to the Greens Senator and Defence spokesman David Shoebridge. Thanks very much for your time. When you look at the images there that Joel reported on and the Australians greeted by the officials in the Rafah crossing, the Australian flag, it's a reminder, just looking at those, how lucky we are at times. You find yourself in trouble. They're wonderful consular officials and our representatives internationally who will look after you if they can.
Well, I think it should be a wake-up call for all Australians about the common humanity we share with people in Gaza, whether or not they have Australian citizenship, whether or not there's an Australian flag on the person greeting them. And you heard there from one Australian citizen fleeing Gaza and talking about her brothers and her sisters and her family who have not been able to escape and may well be killed in an Israeli assault in the next hours, days or weeks. I would hope we see a common humanity regardless of the flag or the nationality when we see those images.
Well, and it's not just those who are permanent residents in that region. There are still dozens, as Joel reported there, dozens of Australians who remain in that limbo, a terrible limbo, and hopefully the government can get them out soon.
Well, the better part of 80 Australian citizens and permanent residents is what we're hearing from DFAT. And right now, they are at risk of being killed at any given moment. And you would have thought that with so many Australians in the middle of a war zone, so many Australians whose lives are at risk, that, if nothing else, would motivate the government to call for an urgent ceasefire and to stop the bombing and the invasion of Gaza. Unfortunately, that's not the case. And of course, I hope, like all Australians, that they can all be safely rescued from there. But the only sure way of keeping those Australians' lives safe is for an urgent ceasefire in the region.
What do you say to the arguments from Israel, but others as well, who would suggest that a ceasefire would give the terrorist group Hamas a chance to regroup?
Well, I would suggest the answer to that is look what's happening on the ground in Gaza. More children killed in these last few weeks than in the last 4 or 5 years of global conflict across the entire planet. Some 8,500 civilians who have lost their lives. And we know that the overwhelming majority of those are women and children. If the strategy of any government is to fight their opponents by working through thousands and thousands and thousands of innocent civilians, any government, if that's their strategy for war making, they should be called out. They should be isolated in that strategy. And that kind of war making should be opposed. Because I think on any fair reading of it, war making using those strategies is war making which is inevitably going to commit war crimes.
But this is a scenario, and I understand the point you're making, but it's not a scenario or an intent of the Israeli government. It's an intent of Hamas using civilians as shields, putting facilities and assets beneath hospitals or in mosques or tunnels under civilian residential homes and so on. It's not the strategy of Israel trying to kill kids. It's Hamas using civilians as shields.
If your argument is that the Israeli Defence Force is neutral as to whether or not they kill children, neutral as to whether or not they kill women, that would be an interesting response given the active obligations that all armed forces have to protect innocent civilians, women and children. But on any view of it, these have been very clear intentional acts from the IDF. We saw in just the last few short days the intentional targeting of a refugee camp where, the numbers vary, but at least dozens and dozens and dozens and possibly upwards of 200 civilians, the majority women and children, were killed in order for the IDF to kill one identified target. Just for a moment, move that particular incident, move that act of violence, take it from Gaza and place it in Israel, or take that act of violence and place it in Melbourne. Would anybody seriously say that is a proportionate response to kill 200 people, civilians in Melbourne, to identify and kill one targeted terrorist? Would anybody say that was a justifiable response in Tel Aviv? Are there different rules? Is that what the world is saying? There are different rules on war. There are different responses to proportionality when the innocent lives being killed are Palestinian. And when you speak to Palestinian Australians and they talk about the fear about the killing of their loved ones, their families in Gaza, they look at this reporting in the media and they say, is it true that in the media reporting in much of Australia that Palestinian lives simply don't matter?
It's a diabolical scenario, and the whole thing is horrendous. But just to put the counter to what you're saying as well, what would happen if 1,400 innocent people were slaughtered, including babies and toddlers, in Australia? What would we do? We would seek to destroy the group that did it. So with that group being a terrorist organisation intent to wipe Israel off the map, do you concede that they're in a battle with a terrorist organisation that is intent on wiping it off the map?
Well, we have seen incidents where Australian troops have been engaged in war crimes. In war crimes in Afghanistan, where the Australian troops were meant to be deployed in accordance with international law. And that has put an indelible stain on part of the Australian military. But the scale of those war crimes is a fraction of what we're seeing in Gaza, a fraction. Without the collective punishment, without the withdrawal of food and medicine and water to millions and millions of civilians. And you think of the outrage, of the quite reasonable and proper outrage in Australia about the war crimes committed by Australian troops in Afghanistan and how long it is going to take to repair the reputation of the Australian Defence Force and to repair the reputation of the Australian government. Now you convert that to the scale of what we're seeing in Gaza, with 8,500 civilians killed, entire suburban neighbourhoods being reduced to rubble, the collective punishment that has been condemned by pretty much every senior figure in the United Nations. One would hope that a friend of Israel would say to Israel, stop, this will create such ongoing violence, such an ongoing stain on the reputation of the
and what about
the
the 200 hostages?
A friend of Israel would urge this to cease.
And the 200 hostages?
Well, there is a very heated debate, as you would know, amongst people in Israel about whether or not the nature and the scale of this attack is in fact killing hostages, and is in some places indifferent to the ongoing threats to those hostages. Of course, we condemn the taking of hostages. Of course, every single viable pressure point, short of war crimes, should be put on Hamas to release those hostages. And of course, we condemn the original appalling acts of violence by Hamas against Israeli citizens on the 7th of October. But none of that leads to a conclusion that the Australian government should not call out war crimes, and that the Australian Prime Minister should not just make statements about being concerned about Palestinian lives, when in fact the call that's been urged upon him by the great majority of the globe and by particularly the Palestinian diaspora in Australia is to call for a ceasefire.
David Shoebridge, appreciate your time. Talk to you soon.
Good speaking, Kieran.